on the air with new details about what that historic surrender and arraignment of former President Donald Trump will look like. The plans and the security to get him to New York to face charges. About 30 charges, according to sources, with new and telling reaction from his political allies and opponents. Our team of reporters is posted up from New York to Florida with every angle of this story. Also happening right now, an extremely dangerous situation, to the point our team in Arkansas had to go find shelter with a rare big warning about serious tornadoes. The video rolling in right now and the forecast live in just a minute. Plus the pictures out of Florida just into us of students marching on the State House there, protesting a push by the governor to expand his so-called Don't Say Gay law, what it says about the next step in the battle over culture wars. And tennis players banned from Wimbledon because of Russia's war in Ukraine, now allowed back on the court. Why that's raising questions about how exactly the Olympics could go down, and the new criticism from Europe about it. Then the new Dungeons and Dragons movie, kind of busting up the old dork stereotype, how it's yet another sign that nerd culture has taken over films, TV, and more a little later on in the show. Hey, I'm Hallie, and in just the last hour, we are getting the TikTok, so to speak, of just how former President Trump's travel plans to New York ahead of that arraignment on Tuesday will go down. According to sources, he'll fly into LaGuardia on Monday night. He'll then take a chopper over to Trump Tower. That's where he has an apartment. He's apparently going to spend the night there before then surrendering himself on Tuesday morning. Then later on that afternoon, 2:15 Eastern, he's set to appear live before flying back home to Florida, again, according to two senior officials familiar with this planning. Let's walk through what we know right now. We have learned from sources that Mr. Trump probably faces around 30 charges related to document fraud. His lawyer says Donald Trump's not going to take a plea. In fact, they're going to try to get this case thrown out. But come Tuesday, Mr. Trump will be arraigned in the same courtroom where Harvey Weinstein was tried, going through the same steps other accused people do go through here. A mugshot, maybe a DNA sample, fingerprints. Just this time, he'll have Secret Service protection. It's coming as we learn dozens and dozens of those Secret Service agents will be involved in preps here, according to sources, with some questions about the broader security picture. We also don't know when this indictment is going to get unsealed or any of the details in it. Yes, that is a biggie. We'll talk more about that. Does this indictment go beyond what we already know about these alleged hush money payments to Stormy Daniels? Right now, you've got the former president in a flurry of posts calling this a witch hunt, saying he's innocent, going after the judge, with a whole lot of other Republicans rallying around him. And if a picture is worth 1,000 words, well, this one says a lot about how Republicans are trying to cast all of it as a political circus. Alabama Republican Congressman Barry Moore trying to make the point the DA would indict a ham sandwich, handing out ham sandwiches that say, indict this. We've got a team of reporters from New York to Florida ready to break all of this down. And Florida is where we start tonight. Dasha Burns is outside the former president's home in West Palm Beach. Talk us through, Dasha, what else do we know and what comes next here?
So what comes next is that arraignment, Hallie, that we are going to see happen on Tuesday. You walked us through a little bit of what the plan is going to look like here. Certainly, we know that Mr. Trump right now is inside of Mar-a-Lago, making these arrangements, working out the logistics and the details and the strategy with his legal team right at this moment. We know that he's going to travel to New York, to LaGuardia Airport on Monday night. He'll stay the night in Trump Tower, show up, surrender to law enforcement on Tuesday morning. He will be in court at 2:15, and he will fly back after that, Hallie. Now, we heard from Trump's attorney, Joe Tacopina, this morning in an interview with our Savannah Guthrie, saying in no uncertain terms that there is a zero chance that the former president will take a plea deal to avoid going to trial here. He says that they have some other strategies, other challenges that they are going to front in order to avoid a possible trial, though he did not go into specifics here, probably in part because there are a lot of questions still here. As you mentioned, we do not yet know what the charges are. The indictment has not been unsealed. What we do know, though, according to two sources familiar, is that several witnesses were questioned about previous alleged hush money payments to Karen McDougal, a former playmate in 2016, also involving Trump. Will the charges have anything to do with that? We do not know. Still a lot of questions here in these historic moments here, Hallie.
Okay, so Dasha, you are standing there not far from the former president's Mar-a-Lago home where he is sort of huddling here and presumably will be over the weekend. Kind of give us the vibe check, right? Because it seemed as though over the last 18 hours or so, 24 hours or so, initial shock about this indictment has really turned to defiance in the eyes of the former president.
Shock turned into defiance, turned into a torrent of posts on his social media platform. Most of them, I counted, I think, 20 plus are segments from Newsmax, from Fox News, of his allies going on TV defending him. A lot of them attacking the Manhattan DA, also going after the judge that is expected to oversee his arraignment next week. Now, this is a posture that we have expected from the former president, considering his rhetoric over the weeks leading up to this indictment. But Hallie, let's not forget, because the former president certainly has not forgotten, although this is such a significant moment because a former president has been indicted, this is also a current presidential candidate that has been indicted. And over the last 24 hours, we've seen a lot of fundraising emails come through our inboxes from the Trump campaign. He is trying to use this moment to raise money, to galvanize support from the grassroots here, and try to use this to help him in the primary campaign, which it actually might, Hallie. The question is, will that actually translate into the general? We also just heard from his daughter, Ivanka Trump, on Instagram. She posted to her story saying, "I love my father. I love my country. Today, I am pained for both. I appreciate the voices across the political spectrum expressing support and concern." Certainly a different tack than her brothers have taken just in the last 24 hours here, Hallie.
Dasha, thank you so much. Let me bring in now Gabe Gutierrez, who is posted up in New York City, where, Gabe, as we've laid out, that is where the action is going to go down here early next week as it relates to former President Trump. We're hearing more, as Dasha has laid out, about the plans for this. What is so interesting here, and part of what makes this so unprecedented, besides the sheer fact of the matter, that we have a former president now indicted, Secret Service has to be coordinating with law enforcement as well. And we have some new reporting on just how they plan to do that.
Yeah, that's right, Hallie, and they are coordinating with NYPD officers here at the scene. And I can tell you there has been a ramped-up security presence we've noticed today. Just earlier this morning, we noticed, them testing out facial recognition machine just here down the street outside of this courthouse, where, as you mentioned, former President Trump is set to be arraigned on Tuesday afternoon. He'll be arraigned, we believe, in the 15th floor of this building. And as our colleague Kelly O'Donnell has reported, dozens and dozens of Secret Service personnel will be on hand to make sure this all goes off without a hitch. But as you said, Hallie, this is unprecedented. There'll be metal detectors to keep certain parts of the courthouse clean, so to speak, in Secret Service parlance, because they still plan to conduct business here while the former president of the United States is arraigned. So certainly a lot of logistical hurdles here, but you laid out the schedule pretty well. So to Dasha, this is what we're waiting for on Tuesday, potentially also to get that indictment unsealed so we can find out more details about these charges, Hallie.
Can you give us any sense, Gabe, of what it's like where you are? Like, I can hear it. There's probably a line of reporters standing doing their live shots. You've got bike racks there. You've got bike racks here in Washington as they're setting up, getting ready for demonstrations. Give us a sense of the scene and what we're hearing in New York. And I know what I'm seeing in Washington, which are more preps, too.
Tell you what, Hallie, I know you like to see this on the show. We're going to take you a little bit behind the scenes here. Ben Parsons, my photojournalist here, can just pan to my left. You can see the row of cameras that is being set up here. This is something that we will see on an exponentially bigger level on Tuesday. There have been security barriers that have been set up here outside of this courthouse. They've been up now for several days, and the NYPD actually sent out a memo to its officers yesterday telling them all the uniformed personnel to be on hand this morning, ready to deploy at 7 a.m. That will continue, obviously, throughout the next couple of days, although we should say that the New York mayor's office has been in touch with the NYPD, and they say right now there are no credible threats here in New York City. But Hallie, today the Capitol Police also put out a statement talking about their preparations, and they say while law enforcement is not tracking any specific credible threats against the Capitol or state offices, there is a potential for demonstration activity. So that's something we're going to be watching here, obviously, for the next several days, whether any of these protests materialize. But NYPD officers here are definitely on alert here in Lower Manhattan, which is very, very busy, as you can hear, on a good day. Hallie.
Sure is. Gabe Gutierrez, I'm sure we'll see a lot of you in the days to come. Appreciate it. Let me bring in somebody else we'll see a lot of, our senior legal correspondent, Laura Jarrett, among the tips of the spear for us as it relates to the reporting effort here. So, Laura, two key new pieces of information as we're coming on the air tonight that you're reporting out. One is the potential for something like 30-plus, roughly, charges in this indictment. The other is there anything about Karen McDougal, right? Somebody else, not Stormy Daniels, involved in this. Help us understand what we know and why 30 charges doesn't necessarily mean 30-plus, like, separate whole crimes here, right?
Right. And part of the issue is, remember how all this gets structured. Michael Cohen is the one who's actually making the $130,000 payment to Stormy Daniels, for which he gets reimbursed. And the way he gets reimbursed, Hallie, is going to matter here for how you see the counts get structured, because it gets done through monthly reimbursement checks to Cohen over the course of a year. Trump is making checks throughout 2017 to Cohen. And so that's why you might see 11 different counts for each of those false invoices that get submitted back to the Trump organization. Now, that's just 11 different checks. So what is the other remaining bit here? That's what we don't know. You can see the checks there, hand-signed by Donald Trump. So what else is in these 30 counts? We just don't know. Could it be tax-related? Could it be banking-related? We don't know. But we do know, in order to elevate the false business records charge, remember that's normally a misdemeanor, to elevate it to a felony, there needs to be a second crime. And that's what we're really going to be focused on Tuesday, when we believe this gets unsealed, trying to figure out what is that additional crime that is going to elevate what is normally a misdemeanor to a felony. It could be a federal law violation. That's something that's been untested in the courts. It could be a state law violation. We just don't know.
How about the idea, and this is something that the former president's attorney got into a little bit today, and I know you picked up on it too, but explain to people why it's significant that this sort of, and I don't want to get too in the weeds here, but this idea that they called this hush money payment, allegedly this business expense.
Yes.
If that only stayed inside the Trump organization, why that's significant? Meaning it wasn't in a filing, campaign finance filing, it didn't go to the IRS, et cetera. Why is that so important here?
You got it exactly. So you don't need a law degree for this. It was hush money, but when they write it on the books of the Trump org, they write it as legal expenses, and that's false. That's a phony business record, and that would be the basis of the charge. The issue is that the statute requires an intent to defraud. An intent to defraud is usually a tax agency or an insurer. And so if it only stayed within the Trump org, Trump's lawyers are going to say, who was defrauded? What was the harm here? That's the argument you're going to start to hear them make on the legal side of things. We've heard a lot of political arguments. That's the argument you're going to hear his lawyers start to make in court.
Laura Jarrett, thank you so much for that. Let's talk about that. We've talked about the legal piece of it. Let's talk about the political piece of it here, starting with President Biden. Ryan Nobles is joining us now from the Hill. President Biden's in Mississippi right now. He is saying Zippo about this indictment. People have seen this. I want to play this soundbite to set up the conversation.
Are you worried it will further divide our country, the indictment?
I have no comment on that. No, I'm not going to talk about Trump's indictment.
Ryan, there's no indication he's going to talk more about Donald Trump's indictment. You know who else is not talking about it? The top Republican in the Senate, that is Mitch McConnell, because look at what Laura just laid out. We don't even really know for sure what is in this indictment. However, plenty of the former president's allies on the Hill are still backing up his claims of political persecution here, and he's working the phones to make sure they do, right?
Yeah, that's right, Hallie. We know that the president has reached out to a number of the people that he trusts up here on Capitol Hill to basically ask for air cover to try and do everything they can to downplay the work of the Manhattan District Attorney Alvin Bragg, at least in the court of public opinion. He's talked to folks like Senator Lindsey Graham and Congressman Matt Gaetz, both of which have been very vocal on television and in other places defending the former president. But it is notable who we haven't heard from yet, and that is basically the bulk of the Senate Republican Republican leadership. Mitch McConnell, the Senate Minority Leader, John Thune, who's second in line, has also not spoken out about this issue. And then also those 3 Republicans who voted to convict Donald Trump in his last impeachment trial after January 6th, Bill Cassidy, Mitt Romney, and Susan Collins, all have yet to weigh in. And that could be, as you point out, Hallie, that they haven't seen the indictment yet and they're not ready to draw any kind of judgment. But we have heard from some people, and most of these Republicans have gone out of their way to attack Alvin Bragg and this process, but not all of them. Lisa Murkowski of Alaska, she put out a statement just a few minutes ago where she said, I am monitoring Donald Trump's legal situation as it unfolds. No one is above the law in this country, but everyone deserves a fair legal process. So that's her basically not trying to work the refs, saying let the legal process play itself out. And then, of course, there are the potential 2024 contenders, among them the former governor of Arkansas, Asa Hutchinson. Listen to how he responded to the Trump indictment.
It is a distraction. It is not a good day for America. But the system has to play out here, and we have to have confidence that it can.
So that's where you have Republicans right now, the vast majority of them rushing to Donald Trump's support. But there are a few outliers who are waiting for the legal process to play itself out, Hallie.
Ryan Noble's live for us on the Hill. Ryan, thank you. Good to see you. Listen, we've got to get to some other breaking news here because we are just starting to see some damage come in after a tornado swept through Little Rock, Arkansas. We want to show you some of it here. There was a funnel cloud, obviously, that formed over the city. This is part of an extremely dangerous storm system. You can see some of the damage there. The city has just put a shelter-in-place order in because guess what? They think more could be on the way. Look at that. Look at that car absolutely flipped over. You see in the background there more damage. The governor of Arkansas is just tweeting out in maybe the last couple of seconds here that there is significant damage. You're looking at it here. At this point, we know that there are millions more who are in the path of this potentially deadly storm. Again, this is all happening as this is unfolding. I want you to listen to what it sounded like when some of the sirens started going off not too long ago. Yeah, that's something you definitely do not want to hear. About 13 million people are under a tornado watch, and it's something the National Weather Service calls a particularly dangerous situation. That is a siren, metaphorically, in addition to that literal siren there. Memphis, Des Moines, St. Louis. I want to bring in now Blaine Alexander, who is live for us here, along with meteorologist Bill Cairns. Blaine, I want to start with you, and I want to explain why we're going to you here. You're in Memphis, Tennessee. We have a team in Arkansas. Yeah. We cannot bring them to you live right now because of how dangerous this situation is. The first priority for us here at NBC News is to make sure our people are safe. They are in a safe situation, huddling to make sure that they are sheltering in place and following the orders of the city. Talk us through then from your vantage point in Memphis, Blaine, how this goes down and how significant this could be.
And Hallie, if I can, I want to touch on that very quickly because
Please.
I've covered I don't know how many storms like this. And this is the first time that I can remember our climate unit, our weather unit there at NBC News, reaching out to every correspondent in the field in the storm's path and saying, listen, this is high risk. This is very dangerous. We want to know where you're going to be so that we can track where that storm is and tell you that you need to get to shelter. Like I said, I've lost count of how many storms I've covered. Haven't seen anything like that. So this really kind of tells us this is a high-risk situation. That's the term that's reserved for when there's a certainty that we will see tornadic activity, that we will see what Bill Cairns put earlier as town-altering storms. Right now I'm in Memphis, and the weather that you just showed is headed my way. We've got about an hour or so, maybe a little bit more before it hits here in Memphis. I've got to tell you, though, that earlier this afternoon, when the storm was still hours away, we could feel that wind. This area has been under a wind advisory for much of the day. We've been under a tornado watch for much of the day. And so really, yes, we've seen rain on and off, but it's those winds that they're certainly concerned about here in this area. We do know that some people are telling folks to, yes, make sure that you have a plan in place. Don't wait until you hear those sirens, but know where you're going to go. Go to your interior rooms, go to your lowest level. That's what we're going to expect to see. Now, another thing that we note about this, Hallie, this is why it's so dangerous and why it's so different, is that we're expecting several supercells to pass over our area. So even though one may blow through, we could think that we're in the clear. There could be two, maybe even three behind that are also going to come, bringing the same level and the same strength of the storm as what we've already seen, Hallie.
And I'm just seeing an alert now that the state of Arkansas has now requested National Guard assistance to come in to help because of how serious this situation is, Blaine.
Yeah, and I think that it certainly goes without saying that this comes right on the heels of what we saw in Mississippi, what we saw in Alabama, and some of those places are still in the storm's path as well, perhaps not bracing for a direct hit like we are in Memphis, but certainly still trying to clean up and are going to be hampered by the severe weather. This really is what we're seeing a lot, though, these storms kind of coming almost one after the other. So, yes, when we're talking about National Guard coming in and helping, it's certainly necessary when you talk about the devastation that you've seen in Arkansas. And keep in mind that we're only getting the first looks. We don't necessarily know what other storms have blown through, what other storms are still to come. And so I suspect that as the hours unfold, and even as we get into tomorrow, we're going to see the full picture of the strength that these storms are bringing with them, Hallie.
Blaine Alexander, thank you. Let me get to meteorologist Bill Cairns. Blaine has laid it out. Bill, you're in the climate unit. I want to be really transparent and honest with our viewers here, right? Like, I don't think we're overstating the level of urgency here, but you give us that gut check.
It's life-threatening, and it's a matter of if towns or cities get hit or not. We know we're going to have strong tornadoes. The one that went through the Little Rock area, just from looking and eyeballing it, it looks like it was probably like an EF2, maybe a low-end EF3. We'll wait and see what they say. But that was on the northwest side of town, and that was crossed over the Arkansas River into northern Little Rock. So that was with that storm. What is happening now, the areas of greatest concern, I'm up here in Iowa. So this just shows you how expansive this is. This is a tornado that is on the ground. It is confirmed. It is large. This is going to be a long track tornado. This is one that we could see on the ground for another hour, maybe even 2 hours. Notice it's about to cross Interstate 80. Right now it's in a fairly rural area, but then it's going to go just to the west side of Iowa City, and you look in the general direction it's headed. These storms, by the way, are traveling at 65 miles per hour. They are flying, and so it's not going to be long before this storm gets up here towards Cedar Rapids. That's one of the things I'm watching closely. Just to the left of this storm, this is also a confirmed tornado on the ground. We were tracking a tornado on the ground in areas of Arkansas near Desark. That's with this storm. I've been watching that closely because right here is Memphis, and I wanted to see how close that would get to the Memphis area. This is going to go north of Memphis. So Memphis, you still have at least probably an hour and a half, at least 2 hours before any storms get to you. Here's kind of the big picture showing you that Chicago's into tornado watch. Des Moines, St. Louis, Memphis, Little Rock, Shreveport, all the way into northeast Texas. I mean, that's just a huge area of the middle of the country that's in these tornado watches. And again, the active tornado warnings right now are in Arkansas. Some new ones I'm noticing here just south of Little Rock. They will miss Little Rock. Then just north of St. Louis here, we have a new tornado warning, about an hour north of St. Louis, just crossing over the Mississippi. So you get the idea. There's a lot of action going on. And this was the map we were referencing. It's been 2 years, Hallie, since we've had high-risk areas. And that just tells you that's the greatest risk of not just a tornado, but a strong tornado. And that's where we're watching those storms I was just mentioning in areas of Iowa, and also these storms that will approach the Memphis area in about 2 hours from now. And these hatched areas is where we're seeing the chance of those strong tornadoes. And I'll end, Allie. There is a cold side of this. I don't want to ignore all our friends. Minneapolis is under a blizzard warning. They're going to wake up on April Fool's Day tomorrow morning with a foot of snow and whiteout conditions, and even that can be life-threatening by itself.
As it relates to the tornadoes, Bill, part of the concern, right, is that people have to just not wait for the sirens to go off. They've got to be alert. They've got to be watching and trying to make sure their phones are charged, et cetera, so that they can get that notice if a tornado that you're talking about is coming close.
That's the biggest problem when you have fast-moving storms, Hallie, because the National Weather Service, they have to wait kind of for the tornadoes to form, and then they can give you the warnings. They can't just guess in advance. And then if they're traveling at 65 miles per hour, that lead time, that time you have when you hear the sirens or your phone goes off to get your family in the bathtub, put a mattress over you, or head to a basement if you're lucky enough to have one, yes, that amount of time is minimized. And as we go through the evening, sun sets, and then it gets even more difficult and even more scary.
Bill Cairns, please stand by. I know you will. We'll be coming back to check in with you as news warrants. Appreciate it. Let's take you to Florida, where students are protesting inside the State House because House Republicans there just passed some new legislation that would restrict how students and teachers use pronouns at school. Look at some of these demonstrations. You can see them, right? People showing up, coming in. The bill, all part of Republican Governor Ron DeSantis' plan to expand that controversial law that critics call the Don't Say Gay law. This new plan would tighten restrictions on lessons in school about sexual identity and gender orientation, banning it through 8th grade. And libraries would have to pull books off shelves within 5 days if somebody objects to what's in those books. The bill still has to go through the state Senate, get signed by the governor. Hallie Vitale joins us now. And Hallie, this is like phase 2, if not phase 3, of this Don't Say Gay controversy building in Florida.
Yeah, and also it's the outgrowth when you see how quickly and frankly almost quietly this expansion moved through the state legislature in Florida. This is the result of a red wave washing over the Sunshine State. It's something that you hear from the governor, Ron DeSantis, there often. This is part of his so-called Florida blueprint as he tries to make tangible policy progress on some of those key tenets of the so-called culture wars that we've seen throughout conservative politics over the course of the last few years. DeSantis is kind of making good on those promises and actually finding ways to legislate around them. The Don't Say Gay bill is just one example of this, but again, it's a reminder that he has really free reign from the legislature in this state now because Republicans control both houses there. Now, again, this has only made its way through the House at this point, but it's expected that the Senate will take it up, and we don't expect too many changes on that front. In terms of the pushback that we're seeing, though, from Democrats at the local level, it sounds pretty much as you would expect, and frankly, as it has in the past, given that this is not a new law, it's an expansion. One state senator there saying that this is the body's duty, the state legislating body's duty, to make sure that every constituent is seen and heard in our legislation. She goes on to say that this bill does nothing but tell certain parts of our community in Florida that they don't exist. Of course, advocates of trans rights have said that this is amounting to effectively erasure of that section and the broader LGBTQ community.
Hallie, Vitale, thank you very much for that. We've got some breaking news in just the last hour or so as we learn that massive lawsuit by Dominion Voting against Fox News over Fox's broadcast of false allegations about the 2020 presidential election, it is going to trial. It is going to a jury. So far as we know, it is a blow to Fox, which had been trying to get the lawsuit thrown out. But late today, a judge denied Fox that push, instead granting a summary judgment. That means the case is set to go to trial in mid-April. Dominion saying in a statement in just the last little bit here that they are gratified by the court's thorough ruling, soundly rejecting Fox's arguments and defenses and finding as a matter of law that their statements about Dominion are false. We look forward to going to trial. Fox is also out with a statement saying it will continue to fiercely advocate for free speech rights and free press as they move to the next phase of these proceedings. Danny Savalos, who's joining us now. It is rare that cases like this one get to where they got, much less get to trial. This is a significant move, and it could have a significant legal implication here. Danny, explain that.
Yeah, procedurally, it's a little complicated, but you can boil it down to this. Each side filed what's called a motion for summary judgment. They're basically saying, hey, judge, all the facts that we're asking about are not in dispute. So if they're not in dispute, this is just a legal issue. You can rule on that. And the jury doesn't need to see it because juries just find facts. They don't reach conclusions of law. So if there is no issue of fact, then the judge can rule on this case. Now, the reality is judges rarely grant summary judgment motions because they're gun shy. They don't want to be the judge that takes a case away from a plaintiff. So it's not really the big news story that the judge denied Fox's motion to throw the case out. That was likely to happen really no matter what. What is really significant to me is that the judge granted Dominion's motion in part, not completely, but it did conclude, and you saw that in Dominion's statement that you just had up there, the court concluded that Dominion did prove that the statements were false. What they didn't prove was actual malice. These are elements of defamation. So in other words, what is now established is the falsity of the statements, which I think is a very big deal, but that doesn't mean Dominion's won yet. They still have to prove what's called actual malice. So in other words, even if the statements were false, if Fox News, for example, I'm just giving an example, had done a ton of research and had reliable sources, then they might avoid liability. So Dominion still has to prove that actual malice standard, but in terms of the statements being false, they've won. It's over.
Danny Savalos, thank you very much. Appreciate it. More breaking news into us tonight with the Army now releasing the names of the 9 soldiers killed in that helicopter training crash in Kentucky. You see their names on screen now. Jeffrey Barnes, Emily Bolanos, Zachary Esparza, Isaac Jangayo, Joshua Gore, whose father called him a real-life Captain America, Aaron Healy, Taylor Mitchell, Rustin Smith, David Salinas. The Army calls it a time of great sadness for these soldiers and their families. They were all from the 101st Airborne Division. The Pentagon still investigating the cause of the crash. We'll be right back. The CDC is out with a new warning tonight. Don't eat that raw cookie dough. What we're learning about a salmonella outbreak linked to flour in the 5 things. But first, you know those blue check marks that some people have on Twitter? Celebrities, politicians, etc. Well, they might start disappearing in the next couple of hours. Starting at midnight, Twitter says some users who are verified are going to have to say goodbye to the blue check or pay up $8 to $11 a month if they want to hold on to their special status on the platform, making this the latest change to Twitter under Elon Musk's control. Already, some big companies and famous people say they're not into this. They don't want to pay for this new Twitter Blue subscription. So the switch up here raises lots of questions about how if, let's say, the actual verified people don't pay and unverified people pretending to be those other people do pay, how do you know who's for real and who's just in it for the troll? How can you get legit and credible info on Twitter? Could misinformation spread even more? Twitter is not responding to NBC's request for comment on all this. Jake Ward is here to break it down. Jake, I realize saying, to some degree, saying like legit and credible and Twitter in the same sentence is not always the move, right? But it does feel like there is a real practical question here of what it's going to look like when people log on tomorrow.
Well, that's right. I mean, Hallie, you know, if you think about the old days in which we used Twitter as a reporting resource, and we still have to from time to time, I mean, Twitter in a lot of ways has stood in for what would have been the sort of civic infrastructure for making, let's say, local announcements. When I, during the summertime here in California, am covering wildfires, I need to know which part of CAL FIRE, the firefighting organization out here, I'm talking to, or, you know, if this road closure is announced, is that particular agency the agency that I think it is, right? And in the old days, the blue checkmark was your quick and easy way of understanding, at least to some extent, this is a verified account, and as a result, my suspicion can kind of get turned down a little bit, and I can focus on the information I'm looking for. Instead, we're now entering this new world, right, where the blue checkmark is not going to denote that at all. By Twitter's own language, it's all it's really going to denote is that the account is going to be non-deceptive, active, and older than 90 days. It will not require accounts to be notable. It'll cost money, and here's the most important thing. It is not going to get verified. This is not going to be something in which Twitter figures out, oh, yes, you really are who you say you are. And so that blue checkmark is no longer going to be useful in that way. Now, government agencies may be able to get a gray checkmark, which is going to somehow designate authenticity there, but it's not clear that that will even happen. And then there's a gold checkmark where if you're some sort of business that is paid for a checkmark, I don't know. Anyway, it used to be that the binary system was a way for us to really know authentic or not, and that's all going away.
There's another piece of this, too, because there's this new, Elon Musk said today he's going to release the algorithm openly, open source. He's going to put the Twitter sort of special sauce out there for people to see. And there are some interesting findings in that, like the way that Twitter kind of labels people, like Musk himself, like people in the world of politics, like power users, right?
Yeah, it's very interesting. You know, we knew that Twitter's source code had actually been leaked on the open source repository called GitHub. Twitter didn't like that at the time. This new announcement is around what the code is that, you know, gets people sort of promoted or not in the algorithm, what pushes them to the top or not. We knew already that these power users, about 50 or so people, journalists, politicians, had been getting pushed hard. Turns out, thanks to the security researcher Jane Wong, we now know that, in fact, Elon Musk has his own special designation that when he tweets, a particular piece of code flags that tweet and pushes him to the top. So it is just weird that at a time when we are struggling to figure out who is who on this platform, who's got a blue, a gray, or a gold checkmark, and what the heck does all of that mean, Elon Musk has his own verification system, which basically just pushes his content to the very top of the heap. It gets more and more confusing by the day, Hallie.
Jake Ward, appreciate it. Thank you for unfurling that for us. Let's get you over to the 5 things our team thinks you should know about tonight. Number 1, the Vatican says Pope Francis will be out of the hospital in Rome tomorrow. He's going to get out, be released. A spokesperson says he's doing well, even had some pizza. Today, he was spotted baptizing a baby in the pediatric ward of the hospital. Look at that video. Remember, the Pope was admitted on Wednesday to be treated for bronchitis. He's expected to be back in St. Peter's Square for Palm Sunday Mass this weekend. Number 2, today, a South African parole board is denying early release for Oscar Pistorius. Remember him, the disgraced South African Paralympian? He was convicted of murdering his girlfriend in 2013. Pistorius says he's done everything in his power to rehabilitate himself. He served almost half of a 15-year sentence, but the parole board says that is not enough time, that it does not meet the minimum period, the minimum time period you need to be released. Number 3, the Justice Department today says it's suing Norfolk Southern for that train derailment in East Palestine, Ohio. I know you remember these images here, right? These pictures of the flames, the toxic chemicals that ended up released into the air. Thousands of people had to evacuate. Concern even now over contamination. The DOJ's complaint says the company violated the Clean Water Act and should be held accountable. Norfolk Southern says they're working with urgency and the direction of the EPA to make it right. Number 4, the CDC is investigating a salmonella outbreak linked to flour, like, the flour that you cook with. Officials say at least half a dozen people, are sick across 11 states. They're trying to figure out what brand specifically is behind this outbreak, but they're saying don't eat or play with any flour that's not been cooked or dough or batter. Number 5, actress Jennifer Aniston is saying a whole new generation of people are finding her hit 90s sitcom Friends, you remember Friends, offensive. She talked about the show at the Paris news agency while promoting her Netflix film Murder Mystery 2. She says there are things they should have thought through, but she doesn't think there was a sensitivity like there is now. We reached out to Aniston for further comment, but haven't heard back. Athletes from Russia and Belarus are learning today they're going to be able to compete again on one of the biggest sports stages in the world, with Wimbledon reversing the ban it put in place last year after Russia invaded Ukraine and announcing that those players will be able to hit the court as neutral athletes. It's coming as the International Olympic Committee is doing the same thing for the Olympics, but catching some heat for it today from Europe. Germany calling it a slap in the face of Ukrainian athletes to let these Russians and Belarusians play. The Polish Prime Minister says the decision is shameful. The IOC is pushing back. Its president saying that kind of criticism is deplorable. Josh Letterman is joining us now. The Wimbledon ruling here says the players have to comply with appropriate conditions. Let's start with tennis, right? What do appropriate conditions at Wimbledon mean exactly for these folks?
Well, Hallie, it means they're going to have to sign declarations of neutrality and commit not to supporting the governments of Russia and Belarus. They're also going to have to commit not to take funding or sponsorships from the Russian or Belarusian governments or from companies that are controlled by them. And even though this is a reversal on the decision they made last year, it wasn't totally surprising, Hallie, because this Wimbledon decision had really gotten a lot of criticism, even from within the sport of tennis itself. And the Association of Tennis Professionals had actually fined Wimbledon for barring Russian and Belarusian athletes, and other sports have started to accept them back into their tournaments. So for a lot of sports watchers, this was kind of a fait accompli.
Talk about the Olympics now, right? Because you have the IOC head who does not seem thrilled about the criticism that the Olympics Committee is getting.
Yeah.
And the reason why he says this criticism is deplorable is because he says these other countries have a double standard. And haven't commented about what he describes as the other 70 wars and armed conflicts in the world. How does this get resolved, if at all? Or is it that the word of the IOC stays the word of the IOC and that's that?
Yeah, I mean, these are separate competitions, and so essentially the IOC will have the final say on their Olympic Games. But, in the meantime, this is getting all kinds of criticism from all over the world, from the Ukrainians, very notably, with the foreign minister, Dmitry Kuleba, calling this decision immoral. He says, has Russia ceased its aggression and atrocities? No. He adds, it's just that Wimbledon decided to accommodate two accomplices in crime. But Wimbledon officials, meanwhile, they are defending this move, saying that it was an incredibly difficult decision, one they did not take lightly or without a great deal of consideration for those who have been impacted. And they're arguing, Hallie, that if they had not reversed this decision, it would have harmed not only Wimbledon, but the sport of tennis itself.
Josh Letterman live for us overseas with that. Josh, thank you very much. Appreciate it. Coming up here on the show, the nation's first ever law that restricts drag show performances set to go into effect in just about 6 hours from now. We've got to look at how some performers are fighting back next. In just about 6 hours from now, Tennessee's new law kicks in, banning drag performances on public property and in places where kids can watch. It's the first time we've ever seen this kind of law go into effect in this country. So what does it mean for performers there? If it's your first-time offense, it's a misdemeanor. If it's a repeated offense, you could face up to 6 years in prison. Our NBC News team is on the ground talking with the folks who will be most affected by all this. Listen.
And all we can do is say that it's bad and it's wrong and please don't do this to us. but they have found us to be a really effective political tool.
Antonia Hilton is live for us in Knoxville, Tennessee. Antonia, you're talking with a mom who's an anti-drag activist. You're hearing from performers who are going to be affected as soon as tomorrow by all this. Walk us through it.
That's right, Hallie. Look, this issue is bigger than Tennessee. This state is going to be the first, but it's certainly not looking like it's going to be the only, because we're seeing bills like this one and similar spreading across the country right now. And what conservative lawmakers who are working on this legislation say is that it's about protecting children and keeping children from seeing overly sexualized performances. But when you talk to drag performers, to members of the LGBTQ community, they say that this bill is just part of an onslaught of bills that we're seeing moving through state legislatures around the country that restrict or change access to things for LGBTQ people and change access to their art forms. And that they feel that this is part of an attack on not just their way of life, the artwork, the jobs and livelihoods that they have, but that potentially will increase threats to them too. This is, of course, an art form, drag, that is, open to everyone, but tends to be associated with the LGBTQ community. Many performers are queer, they are trans, including many of the folks who we met with for a story airing on Nightly News tonight. But conservative parents say that it's a type of artwork, a form of community that they simply don't want in front of their kids. Take a listen to a conversation I had with one mom, Tony Stockton, who lives here in Tennessee, who started a group that's all about pushing back on drag queens being able to interact with and read stories to kids in libraries.
Why protest their events? Why they don't come to your church? So why go and tell them they can't go to a library?
Well, the live and let live is very dangerous. When you don't stand on biblical convictions, people will always go the way of culture.
The lawmakers who wrote this bill, I got to sit down with one of them, Senator Jack Johnson here in Tennessee. They say that this isn't about the LGBTQ community, but when you talk to some of the families and activists on the ground who met with lawmakers who have supported this legislation and other legislation like another bill that is going to ban access to gender-affirming care for trans children, they say that for them, those families, it actually is about what they call an LGBTQ agenda. And that is what we're seeing here. This is the kind of stuff that is driving the culture war in our politics here and is really dividing our country right now, Hallie.
Pull on that thread more, Antonia, because you're alluding to it, but it is not just where you are in Tennessee. There is a broader push against drag performances in other places, too.
That's right. So we have about 14 other states that are working on similar bills right now, that some of which may pass in the coming days or weeks. But the organization GLAAD, which does all kinds of advocacy and support for queer people across this country, they've been tracking this stuff going back a couple years now, and they have found 161 incidents of anti-LGBTQ protests, attacks, and organizing efforts against drag events since early 2022. And so those organizations have been sounding the alarm here, that there's a bigger picture than just one bill in Tennessee, and that people who support queer Americans in their lives or who are living these experiences themselves need to talk to their representatives if this kind of legislation isn't what they want to see passed.
So tonight's original now with in-depth reporting on a topic we've been watching, and tonight it's a look at who's leading all of us locally on the last day of Women's History Month. Right now, only 17 women of color have been voted into mayor's offices in the country's biggest cities. And while that number shows there's still a long way to go, these women are making history now by shattering glass ceilings in their communities and paving the way for a new generation of girls. Here's NBC's Nyala Charles.
Los Angeles is one of the most diverse cities in the country. Yet no woman had ever been mayor until Karen Bass made history.
And I will faithfully discharge the duties.
When she was elected last year.
Were you ever surprised that it took that long to get to that point?
Well, not for me personally, but yes, absolutely. It is incredible to think of how old our city is, and it took this long.
Her situation isn't unique. Bass is only one of a small group of women breaking glass ceilings across the country. Right now, only 33 women lead the nation's largest cities, and only 17 of them are women of color. But that's up 1,600% from 1980.
So what are some of the challenges you have faced specifically as a woman in the position?
I think women in leadership positions are always underestimated.
According to a 2019 study, female mayors are more than twice as likely as men to experience psychological abuse and almost 3 times as likely to experience physical violence.
Are any of you interested in politics?
No, not really.
Why?
The inequality.
Not too far from Bass's office, these high school students are feeling discouraged.
I think a lot of the times in politics, you see the stereotype that women get about being too emotional.
But they say Mayor Bass gives them hope.
Now that we have a woman of color representing, I think it would also inspire other women of color.
Mayor Bass grew up in LA just like them, where she witnessed the civil rights movement, crack epidemic, and growing homelessness with the dream of making it better.
It's like my life has come full circle.
Over in Tucson, Arizona, Mayor Regina Romero is challenging the status quo.
I'm absolutely completely different than the norm.
She's the first woman and Mexican American to hold the title.
It's about me looking back and bringing others through those doors.
Romero is the only one in her family born in the U.S., so she understands the importance of representation.
When I turned 18, my dad was very, very clear with me that I was the only one in the family that would represent all of us.
And in Bakersfield, California, Mayor Karen Go, an Indian immigrant, says she didn't even realize she was breaking barriers until she was elected.
I have never been that conscious of my being different or Asian. My parents taught me that really shouldn't be the focus. Just working with excellence, working hard.
As the city's first mayor of color, she's won consecutive elections with the majority of the vote. These 3 now leading a wave of representation in local government, giving new hope to younger generations.
Now we have someone to look up to, and it just inspires us.
So in a sign of how nerd culture is coming back in a big way, just look at the box office weekend we're heading into. The Dungeons and Dragons movie, highly anticipated, it is out. And listen, it's not just D&D. There's a lot of stuff out there involving things people thought was too dorky for a long time, at least until now, like sort of that weird ghost stuff in Stranger Things, paranormal stuff, sci-fi fantasy in House of Dragons, chess in The Queen's Gambit. And look who's starring in these. Some of Hollywood's biggest leading men and women, Chris Pine, Joe Manganiello, Megan Fox, they're all embracing this. So what does that say about our evolving taste when it comes to all things nerd? B. Dave Walters, author of Dungeons & Dragons, A Darkened Wish, is with us now. So when a movie comes out like D&D, when people have been playing that OG game for a very long time, used to be something you'd be like, oh, I play secretly. Now you have people like Joe Manganiello who's like, oh, I play and I have a whole room for it, everything else. Does the movie match kind of the long history of this game? The reviews seem to be pretty good.
The movie's fantastic. It's so much fun. You don't have to know anything about the game to enjoy it. And yeah, I've seen this thing grow from just a thing we did just kind of in our parents' basement up to being on the main stage of cons. It's just been a great adventure.
The New York Times review, I thought this was interesting, talked about how fantasy adventures are not dweebs only. There's room at the table for all types. And it feels like Dungeons & Dragons is the latest and maybe most vivid example of the way that there's been a shift in what is considered cool in pop culture. And it's not the stuff that like 20 years ago, 15 years ago, when I was coming up in high school and whatever, people thought was cool.
I mean, The Lord of the Rings was 20 years ago.
Right,
so,
right.
I mean,
I
think it goes from The Lord of the Rings and went straight into Iron Man, into the MCU, in being able to admit that you've loved these things since you were a kid. The people that grew up with this content are now the ones making this stuff, and they take it seriously. So, yeah, it is a great time to admit that you love dragons. Who doesn't? And just want to go.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, I'm rambling, please.
I was loving the ramble. I was just gonna, when you talk about Lord of the Rings, I will say, like, I think there was still, it was a huge movie, obviously, but there was still, maybe this is just like we're at, but like still kind of a vibe of like, oh yeah, okay, Lord of the Rings stan, like a little bit, I get it, you're kind of a nerd. There was still like a little bit of that vibe, and I feel like when you talk about Marvel, that is to me what it seems like broke open the floodgates for saying, no, comic books actually are cool and hot and sexy and like all of these things.
Absolutely. You nailed it completely when you said there's room at the table for everybody. But you're right. When people are like, oh, it's okay to love Iron Man. Well, is it okay to love Spider-Man? Well, is it okay to love Superman? And the answer is yes, 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 yes. And now it is okay to love Dungeons and Dragons.
Well, and I know you do. You've seen it, what, once? How many times so far?
Oh, I've seen it twice already, and I'm probably going to see it again tonight. I got to go to a couple of premieres.
I love that. That is so cool. Thank you so much for that breakdown. It's good to see you, Dave Walters. Appreciate it. That does it for us this hour. We've got more coverage picking up right now. Hey there, I'm Hallie, and right now we are tracking what is a very serious situation in Little Rock, Arkansas. There is dangerous weather coming through. We hear that several people have been hurt from this bad weather, these potential tornadoes. And just in the last couple of minutes, we've seen the governor of Arkansas declaring a state of emergency. Look at the damage that we are just getting in here, some of these pictures. You've got, look at that debris there from houses, trees. We've seen cars flipped over. This is just the first of what we're starting to see. Look, you can see some people now out walking around trying to see just how bad it was. Somebody in their car shooting this video, driving through town. The power lines are all crooked. It is not looking good here. And look at that funnel cloud, right? I mean, this is some of what people have been capturing just as we've been on the air here. We talked in our last hour about these storms. Now you are seeing them. 70,000 people have no power. The city is telling people to shelter in place. I want to bring in now Emily Aketa, who is standing by for us in Little Rock. Bill Cairns is with us, and so is Blaine Alexander in Memphis, Tennessee. Emily, first of all, tell us how you're doing. Are you safe? How's your team?
Hey there, Hallie. We are okay. Thank you for asking. We've been sheltering at this hotel just behind our camera and crew who are on the other side of me here. But I can tell you, we've seen some stark changes in weather. You can probably see behind me, we've got the sun out now. But that's really what's been happening all day. You know, it's sunny and then it becomes ominous. And we see all these different kind of elements just barrel through. Earlier today, we saw really heavy sheets of rain, high winds pick up. And then you start to hear things like the tornado sirens. And they have just been going on and off throughout the day. We actually saw back-to-back tornado warnings in this Little Rock area. And so with our crew, we had to go down into the basement, take shelter in the tornado shelter as these storms pass through. And at one point, just across this river here, the Arkansas River here, it appeared what looked like a funnel forming. We actually saw that as the storms were coming through here. And just north of where I am, that's where some of the worst damage is reported. We are starting to hear more about downed trees, just buildings torn apart, people comparing it to like the power of these storms just tossing toys around. It just came with such rigorous and momentum, and it was a fast-moving storm at that. We're also beginning to hear reports of some injuries, but in talking to various authorities, you know, it's hard to gauge just how widespread those numbers are at this point because it's so early on in the process. And an important thing to keep in mind, Hallie, is, you know, the threat is not over. We will continue to see some severe weather barrel through here. And so they're really encouraging people. It's not done. We still have to hunker down. You have to be weather aware for the rest of the day here.
What you're saying is part of what's so scary, Emily, because it looks like a bluebird day behind you, right? Like if you didn't know what was happening around you, you'd think you were standing there and everything was fine. That is part of what makes this so dangerous. I know that officials want to make sure people do not get complacent. That's why there's a state of emergency where you are.
Yeah, absolutely. And you also mentioned that state of emergency just being declared. And earlier in the day, we started to hear more from the mayor, who asked and requested for assistance from the National Guard. And so we're starting to see some of that response pour in. And, you know, I mentioned those tornado sirens earlier in the day. Now the types of sirens we're hearing are fire trucks and ambulance, those kinds of sirens. So it's kind of this eerie switch in tone here as we start to see some of the response after this devastating storm barreled through.
Emily Aketa live for us in Little Rock. I'm glad you and your team are safe. Thank you, and thank you for keeping us updated. I appreciate it. Let me bring in Bill Cairns here for a second. Where are the storms now? Blaine, we'll get to you. I know you're in Memphis. Bill, where is the area of biggest concern as we speak?
We have a couple spots, Iowa and Arkansas. I'll get into that in a second. So we're up to 17, Hallie. I was with you last hour. We only had 8, so we're getting numerous reports of tornadoes in many different areas.
So we've had 9 in just 60 minutes.
Yeah, at least. And they're coming in quickly now. All the storm chasers out there, just incredible pictures and videos. Some of these tornadoes that we've had in southern Iowa look to be monsters, very, very strong. And they haven't gone through cities or towns, but I know there's some farm towns and some houses and barns that have been just obliterated and destroyed destroyed in that area. So let me give you a closer view. So here's Cedar Rapids. Iowa City is located right here. They just had a tornado nearby, tornado warnings surrounding the city and near the city. That we're going to keep track of. And we've had numerous tornado warnings to the south here. This big tornado started in Ottumwa, and that headed up here towards the Iowa City area. That was the one you're going to see a lot of pictures of in the days ahead. It's just over farmland, and it's just this big, huge brown beast just chewing the earth up and the dust and the dirt and debris into the sky. So here's St. Louis. This is further to the south. This is Interstate 44. We had a tornado warning around Rolla. This storm is heading right up Interstate 44 at about 60 miles per hour. And if we project that for about an hour from now, that's very near St. Louis. So this is something to watch for the St. Louis area and anywhere here along Interstate 44. Haven't had a confirmed tornado with it yet, but we do expect it easily could drop at any time. And then to the south in areas of Arkansas. So here's Memphis. Memphis, you're safe for now, but we have a tornado emergency for Earl, population a little under 2,000. We have a confirmed large tornado on the ground. Storm spotters have told us it already did significant damage in the town of Wynne, Arkansas, and it's right over the top of Earl as we speak. So we pray for them, and we'll give you updates if we hear how they did as this heads just, it looks like, barely to the north of town. Hopefully it misses the downtown area. So here's the big picture from Iowa all the way to northeast Texas. All of these areas are under a tornado watch, and we're only about halfway through this event. I mean, this is going to continue probably well until midnight, maybe even a little after that in areas, especially of Illinois, Indiana, and eventually into Tennessee. But these high-risk areas where we're seeing these big tornadoes, that's happening now in areas from Cedar Rapids to Peoria. And we still have to wait for these storms to get to this region from Greenville, Mississippi to Memphis. Those storms will be with you in about an hour or two. Those are the ones that are going to get there as the sun is setting. That'll be extremely dangerous, and that's where we have the chance of not just tornadoes, but even strong tornadoes. And Hallie, will end it with this. Tomorrow, heads up to everyone from Pittsburgh to Albany to New York City and Philadelphia. It's not tornadoes, but it is going to be strong winds when these thunderstorms come through, and that's going to be during your Saturday.
Bill Cairns, thank you. I want you to stand by just for one more second while we go to Blaine, because the maps that you laid out showed that the threat is likely, as far as we know, and again, this thing is going to change. We're going to see what happens. But it's Arkansas and Iowa. It is hitting now incredibly hard, less so you in Tennessee. But Blaine, you and your team, I know, have been ready for this. We're monitoring what's happening where you are not long after those awful tornadoes in Mississippi.
Absolutely, and we're staying in constant touch with our climate team there at NBC News as well. We're watching everything that you just saw Emily report on, everything that Bill is saying, because, yes, that is the weather that we are concerned about here in Memphis, essentially coming right across the Mississippi River and slamming right into Memphis. So that's why we're here in this busy entertainment district. We know that hotels nearby, at least one restaurant, they already have mapped out their safe areas. This is usually a bustling place, but they're telling, for instance, every guest that checks in, hey, we're expecting weather. This is where you need to go to stay safe. Some of the restaurants in the area are doing the very same thing because they're taking this very seriously. And as you mentioned, you don't have to look very far back in time to see a tragic example of what these storms can do. We know what we saw in Mississippi. We know what we saw in Alabama. And these are the same types of storms that are now moving in and sweeping across here. One thing that I do want to point out, though, again, is that it's not just one isolated threat. So when we talk about Memphis, when we talk about all of the cities in the path of these storms, we're not talking about just kind of one cell moving through. We're talking about multiple bands that could bring multiple threats. So that's why they want people to stay on alert for really the large portion of this evening. Hallie.
Blaine Alexander live for us in Memphis. Thank you, Blaine, for that. I appreciate it. Let's turn now to the other big news of the day here in Washington and up in New York. The TikTok, so to speak, of how former President Donald Trump's travel plans to New York are expected to go down ahead of that historic arraignment on Tuesday. Here is what our team is learning in just the last few hours, that the former president is expected to fly into LaGuardia Airport Monday night and then chopper over to Trump Tower, where he'll spend the evening before surrendering Tuesday morning. Then at about 2:15 Eastern, he's going to appear before flying back home to Florida later on that day, according to two senior officials. Again, the mileage may vary here. This is what we know as of Friday night. Tuesday is still an eternity away, so to speak, in some of this world, if you will. Here's what we know right now. NBC News has learned that Mr. Trump probably faces around 30 charges related to document fraud, according to two sources. His attorney says the former president is not going to take a plea deal. They actually want to get the case thrown out altogether. Come Tuesday, Mr. Trump will be arraigned in the same courtroom where Harvey Weinstein was tried. We're just now hearing there are no plans to handcuff him or put him in a cell. He may not get a headshot because there's not like a photography machine, a camera, if you will, that takes those headshots in that room. and he will be surrounded by Secret Service. He is, after all, a former president and current presidential candidate. Dozens and dozens of Secret Service agents are involved in the preps here, according to what our team has learned from their sources. We don't know critically when this indictment is going to get unsealed or what is in it, the details. That is a big deal. Does it go beyond what we know about the payments to Stormy Daniels? Could it be anything about payments involving the woman you see there, Karen McDougal? We'll explain that in a minute. Right now, the former president is out posting. He's truth socialing on his social media platform. Again, calling this a witch hunt. Again, saying he's innocent. Again, going after the judge now who will oversee this indictment, this arraignment rather, with a whole lot of other Republicans rallying around him. And listen, if a picture is worth 1,000 words, take a look at this one, which says a lot about how Republicans are trying to cast this as a political circus. Those are ham sandwiches getting passed out by Alabama Republican Congressman Barry Moore, trying to make the point that the DA here would indict a ham sandwich. Team of reporters ready to break this down for us, covering every angle from New York to Florida. Let me start with Gabe Gutierrez, who is in New York City, where there is real security in place here. I imagine that is going to continue to ramp up over the next 72-plus hours. And there has been a flurry of sort of back and forth on what the timing of this looks like, how this is going to go down. This had been a key question as the news broke, Gabe, 24 hours ago. We were in that special report live here on NBC News Now as that was happening, wondering, would Donald Trump go up to New York and surrender? Would he be arraigned up there? It sounds like, from what we know, the answer to that question is certainly yes here. Talk us through it.
Yeah, that's right, Hallie. All signs point to yes. And even from when I spoke with you in the last hour, there has been those new developments. According to reporting from our colleague Jonathan Dienst over at WNBC, he does say, according to two officials involved with the planning, as you laid out, that this is all going to unfold Monday into Tuesday with former President Trump coming up to New York from Mar-a-Lago, then overnighting at Trump Tower. Now, the timing, the exact hours that we expect this all to go down on Tuesday, that still remains very fluid. But the best we know right now is that we believe he will be driven here at some point from Trump Tower around 1 o'clock or so, in time for that 2:15 court appearance. But again, talks are still very fluid. As you mentioned, Hallie, no mugshot is expected at the time. He's not expected to be put in handcuffs or any sort of holding cell. He will be processed. He will be fingerprinted in a back area of the courtroom on the 15th floor in the building behind me. Another point is that they plan to adjourn all the courtrooms in that part of the building in order to cut down on crowds. Again, going back to that security concern. But some of the courtrooms in the lower part of the building, arraignments, other arraignments, so to speak, will go on as planned. But as you can see behind me, Hallie, there are security barricades here. There's a very heavy police presence, and they are monitoring for any concerns when it comes to security. But those logistical conversations are going on as we speak, Hallie.
It's the logistical conversations, it's the political conversations, it's the legal conversations as well, Gabe. I mean, there's a lot of layers to this here. What's the biggest thing that you will be watching for come Tuesday?
Well, certainly, you mentioned that those 30 potential counts, and according to several officials involved in the grand jury investigation are familiar with it, they do say that at least some of those counts are related to documents fraud. Now, the question becomes, what type of fraud are we looking at? You raised it in your introduction. We had been hearing about those hush money payments to Stormy Daniels that occurred right before the 2016 election, an affair that former President Trump has repeatedly denied. And he's denied any wrongdoing. But we've also learned just within the past day or so that, the prosecution asked witnesses about other hush money payments to Karen McDougal, that other Playboy model that alleged an affair with Donald Trump as well, which he has also denied. So what role will that play in that? It all remains an open question at this point. Again, that indictment under seal until we believe on Tuesday, when we expect to learn more about that, Hallie.
Gabe Gutierrez, live for us in New York. Gabe, thank you. Danny Savalos, let me bring you in here. 30 charges doesn't mean 30 separate crimes necessarily, right? Explain that.
What could mean, I mean, if there are, say, 30 counts, what you may have is a number of counts that arise out of a single transaction. So maybe one document signed that a number of different frauds were created out of that. Prosecutors do that all the time. They'll take a single transaction and find different crimes, and there may be even lesser included offenses sometimes. You really can't tell. So you could see a ton of crimes, but based on 2 or 3 or 4 transactions. You may also see, and I'm still holding out the possibility, you may see charges related to the inflation of Trump's real estate value when it suited him and the deflation when it came to taxes. I know that seems like a vanishingly small likelihood, but with 30 counts, it's always possible because we really don't know for sure until it's unsealed.
That's such an important part of this, right? Because there is listen, we have reporting based on sources suggesting what this is all about. But until those papers, right, are fresh off the printers, until they're unsealed, really nobody knows about this. I want to play for you, including, by the way, the former Attorney General of the United States, Bill Barr, who is talking about this indictment. It's interesting. I want to play a piece of this.
It's the archetypal abuse of the prosecutorial function to engage in a political hit job.
So he is obviously not the only one who's saying and kind of backing up the former president's claim politically that this is politically motivated. But what he also said is that it's and I'm quoting here, he said it's a pathetically weak case. What evidence would he have to back up that case? Help us understand the legal piece of the strength of this case here.
Assuming for the moment we're talking about falsification of business records related to the Stormy Daniels hush money payments, there are problems with the case. I'm not going to say it's pathetically weak. I wouldn't use that language, but it is a defensible case. Now, on the other hand, is there enough for an indictment? Yes. I mean, you can get to probable cause. It's a lesser burden, and there are some issues that Trump is going to have to contend with, but it is defensible. There are several different reasons. The one that jumps out at me is the possibility that New York simply may not be able to use a federal election law crime as a predicate to elevate the normally misdemeanor falsification of business records crime up to a felony. You need that additional crime. Maybe they did find a New York State crime that sufficed. You might have a tax law violation, not a federal tax law violation, but a New York State tax law violation. That makes it a lot cleaner and a lot more difficult to defend because you're not dealing with the fact that New York may not have the jurisdiction to enforce or even invoke a federal election law violation. But any of those thorny complexities are ripe for a defense motion to dismiss. So that's one example. There are several others because Trump does a good job of creating so many buffers between him and the naughty conduct.
Danny Savalos, thank you very much. Hallie Vitale, let me bring you in on Capitol Hill. And part of what's been interesting to see on the political reaction of all of this are Republicans coming out and rallying around Trump, although as Danny laid out, we don't know specifically what is in the indictment yet. Some Republicans are seeming to take, let me say, small number of Republicans and those who have not often been allied with Donald Trump are seeming to take a bit of a wait-and-see approach. I'm thinking of Senator Mitch McConnell, for example, top Republican in the Senate, who notably hasn't said much. He has beefed with Donald Trump, so it's not surprising he hasn't come out to his defense at this point. But the dynamic politically, we showed it in the ham sandwich thing. Most of the former president's allies on the Hill are trying to fan the flames that he has put out there, that this is, in fact, a political persecution.
Yeah, and they don't need to read the indictment to know that they're going to back him and support him. We even saw when this indictment was just theoretical. When I was in Orlando, Florida, with House Republicans for their annual retreat a week ago, this was just something that could happen. And we were already watching Speaker Kevin McCarthy use the powers that he has as majority leader to leverage key people on his committees to actually defend the former president. So we know what most Republicans are doing. But you're right. Those who aren't are not people who are close to the former president. Yes, Mitch McConnell is among them. He's probably the biggest voice in terms of congressional leaders who have not yet said anything. But I can put more of them up on the screen for you because John Thune is there as well. He's, of course, McConnell's deputy in terms of how Senate leadership breaks down. And then the other Republican senators who we would typically look to, those who actually voted to convict Trump in his 2021 impeachment, Bill Cassidy, Mitt Romney, Susan Collins, we have not heard from them either, despite having reached out to them repeatedly. And then you look at some of the people who are actively saying that this process should play out. I think I counted 2 of them on the House Republican side, very few of them also on the Senate side. And then you consider the 2024 implications of this. Most of the people in that would-be field are backing Trump, except for Governor Asa Hutchinson. Watch what he said.
going to further divide our country. The indictment.
It is a distraction. It is not a good day for America. But the system has to play out here, and we have to have confidence that it can.
And then, of course, you have Senator Lisa Murkowski, to take it back here to the Senate, someone who did vote for the Trump indictment, but who's also now saying that she's just monitoring the situation as it unfolds and reminding people that no one's above the law.
There's also another piece of this, Hallie, when it relates to Alvin Bragg, who is now in this white-hot spotlight, the Manhattan District Attorney himself, who has reassured his prosecutors that he will defend them in the face of any threats against them here. He's in this sort of back and forth with House Republicans on the Hill, and he is again clapping back at them. He's saying he's not going to cooperate with their push to, in his words, interfere with legal proceedings in New York State.
Yeah, this is yet again, even before the indictment was rolled out and voted on, just when it was theoretical and Trump was saying that he thought he was going to get indicted on a Tuesday based on really nothing, this is what House Republicans did. They leveraged the power of their majority. 3 powerful committee chairmen asked Bragg to come in and basically defend this decision to indict the former president. Bragg fought that. Of course, the committee chairman came back to him, and now this is the latest overture in this back and forth here from Bragg's office, saying effectively to the lawmakers, you and many of your colleagues have chosen to collaborate with Mr. Trump's efforts to vilify and denigrate the integrity of elected state prosecutors, trial judges, and made unfounded allegations that the office's investigation, his office's, Bragg's, has conducted this investigation via an independent grand jury of average citizens serving New York State. They're alleging that it's politically motivated. Bragg, of course, goes on to this letter to enumerate all the reasons why it is not. Again, right now, these lawmakers are just asking Bragg to come before them. It would be a big deal if they actually ratcheted that up and subpoenaed him. That would put us in another really sticky territory. But right now, we're watching the ways that Bragg is trying to inoculate himself from this kind of investigatory request, and the ways that Republicans, at least right now, look like they're going to continue pressing on for it.
Hallie Vitale live for us on the Hill. Hallie, thank you. We want to get to some more breaking news tonight with the Army releasing the name of the 9 soldiers killed in that helicopter training crash in Kentucky. You see them on screen now. Jeffrey Barnes, Emily Bolanos, Zachary Esparza, Isaac Jangayo, Joshua Gore, whose father called him a real-life Captain America, Aaron Healy, Taylor Mitchell, Rustin Smith, David Salinas. The Army calls it a time of great sadness, of course, for these soldiers and their families. They were all from the 101st Airborne Division, and the Pentagon is still investigating the cause of the crash. Coming up in the 5 things why Jennifer Aniston thinks a lot of young people now think Friends, the show, is kind of offensive. But first, you know those blue check marks some people have on Twitter, celebrities, politicians, etc., they might start going away in the next couple of hours, because starting at midnight, Twitter says some users who are verified are going to have to say goodbye to the blue check or pay up $8 to $11 a month if they want to hold on to their special status on the platform. That makes this the newest change under Elon Musk's control. Already, some big companies and celebrities say they're like not into this. They don't want to pay for it. They don't want Twitter Blue. That's what the subscription's called. So the switch up here raises lots of questions about how if, let's say, the actual verified people don't pay and unverified people pretending to be those other people do pay, how do you know who's for real and who's just faking it? How can you get legit and credible info on Twitter? Could misinformation spread even more? Twitter hasn't responded to NBC News' request for comment on this, but Jake Ward is here to break it down. Jake, I realize saying, to some degree, saying like legit and credible and Twitter in the same sentence is not always the move, right? But it does feel like there is a real practical question here of what it's going to look like when people log on tomorrow.
Well, that's right. I mean, Hallie, you know, if you think about the old days in which we used Twitter as a reporting resource, and we still have to from time to time, I mean, Twitter in a lot of ways has stood in for what would have been the sort of civic infrastructure for making, let's say, local announcements. When I, during the summertime here in California, am covering wildfires, I need to know which part of CAL FIRE, the firefighting organization out here, I'm talking to, or, you know, if this road closure is announced, is that particular agency the agency that I think it is, right? And in the old days, the blue check mark was your quick and easy way of understanding, at least to some extent, this is a verified account, and as a result, my suspicion can kind of get turned down a little bit, and I can focus on the information I'm looking for. Instead, we're now entering this new world, right, where the blue check mark is not going to denote that at all. By Twitter's own language, it's all it's really going to denote is that the account is going to be non-deceptive, active, and older than 90 days. It will not require accounts to be notable. It'll cost money. And here's the most important thing. It is not going to get verified. This is not going to be something in which Twitter figures out, oh, yes, you really are who you say you are. And so that blue check mark is no longer going to be useful in that way. Now, government agencies may be able to get a gray check mark, which is going to somehow designate authenticity there, but it's not clear that that will even happen. And then there's a gold check mark where if you're some sort of business that is paid for a check mark, I don't know. Anyway, it used to be that the binary system was a way for us to really know authentic or not, and that's all going away.
There's another piece of this, too, because there's this new, Elon Musk said today he's going to release the algorithm openly, open source. He's going to put the Twitter sort of special sauce out there for people to see. And there are some interesting findings in that, like the way that Twitter kind of labels people, like Musk himself, like people in the world of politics, like power users, right?
Yeah, it's very interesting. You know, we knew that Twitter's source code had actually been leaked on the open source repository called GitHub. Twitter didn't like that at the time. This new announcement is around what the code is that, you know, gets people sort of promoted or not in the algorithm, what pushes them to the top or not. We knew already that these power users, about 50 or so people, journalists, politicians, had been getting pushed hard. Turns out, thanks to the security researcher Jane Wong, we now know that, in fact, Elon Musk has his own special designation, that when he tweets, a particular piece of code flags that tweet and pushes him to the top. So it is just weird that at a time when we are struggling to figure out who is who on this platform, who's got a blue, a gray, or a gold check mark, and what the heck does all of that mean, Elon Musk has his own verification system, which basically just pushes his content to the very top of the heap. It gets more and more confusing by the day, Hallie.
Jake Ward, appreciate it. Thank you for unfurling that for us. Let's get you over to the 5 things our team thinks you should know about tonight. Number 1, the Vatican says Pope Francis will be released from a hospital in Rome tomorrow. A spokesperson says he's doing well, even had some pizza. Today, he was spotted baptizing a baby in the pediatric ward. Take a look at this. You're about to see it. How special is that? The Pope was admitted to the hospital Wednesday, remember, to be treated for bronchitis. He's expected to be back in St. Peter's Square for Palm Sunday Mass. Number 2, breaking in just the last hour here, we are learning that Senator John Fetterman is now out of the hospital after being treated for clinical depression. The Pennsylvania Democrat had been at Walter Reed since the end of February. He is now back in Pennsylvania. In a statement, Fetterman says he's excited to be the father and the husband he wants to be. And his message, he says, is that depression is treatable and treatment works. He'll spend the next couple weeks at home before heading back to the Senate in mid-April. Number 3, the Justice Department today is announcing it's suing Norfolk Southern for that train derailment in East Palestine, Ohio last month. I know you remember these pictures, that crash that released toxic chemicals into the air. Thousands of people had to evacuate. There are concerns about contamination even now. The DOJ's complaint says the company violated the Clean Water Act and should be held accountable. Norfolk Southern says they're working with the EPA to make it right. Number 4, a school district in Nebraska today is now facing a lawsuit for shutting down a high school paper after the paper published an LGBTQ+ focused edition. The lawsuit from a former high school journalist and the Nebraska High School Press Association says the school violated the students' First Amendment rights. The newspaper has since been brought back only digitally. The district did not immediately respond to our request for comment. Number 5, actress Jennifer Aniston says a new generation of folks are finding Friends, her show from the 90s, offensive. She talked about it with the Paris news agency while promoting her new Netflix movie. She says there are things they should have thought through on Friends, but she doesn't think there was a sensitivity back then like there is now to different topics. We reached out to Aniston for further comment, but haven't heard back. Athletes from Russia and Belarus are learning today they're going to be able to compete again on one of the biggest sports stages in the world, with Wimbledon reversing the ban it put in place last year after Russia invaded Ukraine and announcing those players will be able to hit the court as neutral athletes. That's as the International Olympic Committee is doing the same thing for the Olympics, but catching some heat for it today from Europe. Germany calling it a slap in the face of Ukrainian athletes. The Polish prime minister saying that the decision is shameful. And the IOC is pushing back, with its president saying that kind of criticism is deplorable. Josh Letterman is joining us now. The Wimbledon ruling here says the players have to comply with appropriate conditions. Let's start with tennis, right? What do appropriate conditions at Wimbledon mean exactly for these folks?
Well, Hallie, it means they're going to have to sign declarations of neutrality and commit not to supporting the governments of Russia and Belarus. They're also going to have to commit not to take funding or sponsorships from the Russian or Belarusian governments or from companies that are controlled by them. And even though this is a reversal on the decision they made last year, it wasn't totally surprising, Hallie, because this Wimbledon decision had really gotten a lot of criticism, even from within the sport of tennis itself. And the Association of Tennis Professionals had actually fined Wimbledon for barring Russian and Belarusian athletes, and other sports have started to accept them back into their tournaments. So for a lot of sports watchers, this was kind of a fait accompli.
Talk about the Olympics now, right? Because you have the IOC head who does not seem thrilled about the criticism that the Olympics Committee is getting.
Yeah.
And the reason why he says this criticism is deplorable is because he says these other countries have a double standard and haven't commented about what he describes as the other 70 wars and armed conflicts in the world. How does this get resolved, if at all? Or is it that the word of the IOC stays the word of the IOC and that's that?
Yeah, I mean, these are separate competitions, and so essentially the IOC will have the final say on their Olympic Games. But, you know, in the meantime, this is getting all kinds of criticism from all over the world, from the Ukrainians, very notably, with the foreign minister, Dmitry Kuleba, calling this decision immoral. He says, has Russia ceased its aggression and atrocities? No. He adds, it's just that Wimbledon decided to accommodate two accomplices in crime. But Wimbledon officials, meanwhile, they are defending this move, saying that it was an incredibly difficult decision, one they did not take lightly or without a great deal of consideration for those who have been impacted. And they're arguing, Hallie, that if they had not reversed this decision, it would have harmed not only Wimbledon, but the sport of tennis itself.
Josh Letterman live for us overseas with that. Josh, thank you very much. Appreciate it. When we come back in just a few hours, drag shows are going to be restricted in Tennessee. We're live in Knoxville with how performers there are reacting to this first ever law. In just about 6 hours from now, Tennessee's new law kicks in, restricting drag performances on public property and in places where kids can watch. It's the first time we've ever seen this kind of law go into effect in this country. So what does it mean for drag performers there? First-time offenders get misdemeanors. Repeat offenders could face up to 6 years in prison. Our NBC News team is on the ground talking to the folks who will be most affected by this. Listen.
And all we can do is say that it's bad and it's wrong and please don't do this to us. But they have found us to be a really effective political tool.
Antonia Hilton is live for us in Knoxville, Tennessee. Antonia, give us a sense of what you're hearing from people there and how this law is being received.
Hallie, this law is on a lot of folks' minds here, and it has been the subject of intense debates leading up to tonight as this first-of-its-kind law goes into effect. The law, as you spelled out, it's going to restrict drag performances in public or anywhere that a child could possibly see the performance take place. And conservatives who have written this legislation, they say that it's all about protecting children, keeping them from seeing over-sexualized performances. Supporters of the bill, particularly the evangelical community here and ministries that have done a lot of the activism around this issue, they say that it's about making sure that kids do not become confused about their gender. But for the performers who've been doing this work, you know, drag is an art form that has been in the United States or around the world really for hundreds of years, say that their work has been unfairly characterized and that this is just one piece of legislation of many that we're seeing across the country right now that they say are designed to target and further marginalize LGBTQ people. I want you to take a listen to a conversation that I had with one mom who's been part of the organizing effort here against drag performances. Take a listen to her perspective.
Why protest their events? Why they don't come to your church?
Right,
so why
right.
go and tell them they can't go to a library?
Well, the live and let live is very dangerous. When you don't stand on biblical convictions, people will always go the way of culture.
The lawmakers that I've spoken to, including the senator who authored this legislation, say that it really has nothing to do with LGBTQ people, that it's not designed to target them. But when you talk to some of the community members who, lobbied for this legislation, including the woman, Tony Stockton, who you just met there, they say that for them, it is about what they call the LGBTQ agenda and wanting to keep those issues away from their children. Hallie.
It's also broader than just Tennessee, Antonia.
That's right. We're seeing a number of bills across the country right now. When it comes to drag performances, at least 14 other states are working on legislation very similar to what's about to go into effect here in Tennessee. But organizations like GLAAD have been tracking hundreds of bills moving across state houses in the country right now, and they've been tracking incidents related to these issues. GLAAD alone has found about 161 incidents of anti-LGBTQ protests, events, and meetings that are designed to target drag performances, and that's just going back to early 2022. And we expect to see more of that in the coming days and weeks, potentially here in Tennessee, but also in other states like Texas and Florida. Here in Tennessee, on the other side of the state in Memphis, one theater company is already launching the first federal lawsuit against this law. And people are looking for a way to push back. They argue, civil rights attorneys, as well as the performers who are going to be affected by all this, they argue that this is a threat to their First Amendment rights. And so we should expect those issues to play out in court very soon.
Antonia Hilton, thank you very much. Live for us in Knoxville. Coming up here on the show, more breaking news on those powerful tornadoes and that very bad weather we've been tracking. Where this storm is headed next, we're going to have Bill Cairns live when we come back. So we want to come in here with some breaking news and an update on those powerful tornadoes we've been watching during this show. You are seeing some of these images that we have just been cleared to show you now of what has happened. The governor of Arkansas has activated the National Guard, and we are working actively now to confirm any potential injuries as we are just starting to see some of the damage here with more reporting on where this tornado is headed next. We told you Arkansas and Iowa. Well, look at what we've just seen in Iowa. A huge cloud. And on the ground in Little Rock, you see those buildings already ripped up. That's what's on your screen here. Nearly 85,000 people are without power in Arkansas. Meteorologist Bill Cairns is watching all of this. Where is the most activity happening now?
We have a huge tornado on the ground just north of Memphis, about 15 miles from the city. That one has done significant damage. That's what we call a long-track tornado. It's been on the ground for a while. In Wynne, Arkansas, reports of a roof collapse at the high school. So there's numerous things going on all at the same time. And you just showed one of those pictures, the video of the Iowa tornadoes. The tornadoes that have been in southern Iowa are just monsters. They're just huge and they're intense. And most of them were over farm fields. I'm sure that some barns and houses were hit too, unfortunately. But we haven't gotten any confirmation in Iowa that any cities or towns have been altered forever. So we'll wait and see. And there's the video of that one in Iowa. I mean, look at the size of this. And there's a reason why storm chasers go to Iowa. If you look at the pictures from Arkansas, you see trees and hills. You can't get good visibility of the storms. But obviously Iowa, cornfields, soy fields, completely flat. And you see pictures and images like this were just incredible, looking at that large wedge tornado on the ground there. And I know there's damage in Iowa. I'm sure there is. And I'm sure lives have been changed forever. We just don't have any confirmation of that now. So, yeah, let me get into show you.
Let me just, Bill, I'm sorry to interrupt you. I just want to share a piece of information. Our team has just confirmed. We talked about actively reporting out on these injuries. We are hearing now from a hospital facility in Arkansas, 21 patients injured. Okay. 5 of those patients in critical condition with 2 medical centers in Little Rock and North Little Rock. This is coming from the Baptist Health Medical Center. Their spokespeople confirming here to NBC News. I wanted to let folks know because you talk about the potential for the threat to life, and it is obviously an extremely concerning situation.
And with the Little Rock one, that hit right when they were letting out of schools. So a lot of people were very concerned with a tornado that looks like it was probably maybe at least an EF2 strength at a time of day when there's a lot of traffic, kids are coming home on buses or walking home, and tornado sirens are going off. You can just imagine the chaos and the stories and the stress on all the families in that situation. So that's just one piece of this puzzle. So all of these red icons show you where we've had the tornadoes. The big Iowa ones we were showing you were all right in here, just south of Cedar Rapids, south of Iowa City. This was the Little Rock tornado. And the one I was mentioning that we're watching on the ground now, here's Memphis, and that's this tornado here, the one where we've had the damage. So here's the Iowa view first, and look at this. this. 1, 2, 3, 4. I got 5 tornado warnings in a row here on this line of storms. And Davenport is in this too. So we'll continue. The Davenport, you probably have about 15, 20 minutes. The tornado sirens are going off. Everyone's getting to their shelters as we speak. I mentioned St. Louis about a half hour ago. We were watching this storm. It has weakened, thankfully. There's no longer a tornado warning with it, but it doesn't mean it can't regenerate. So St. Louis, you have to keep an eye out about a half hour from now, some of the stronger storms for you. And then this was the tornado report where the high school was in Arkansas that was damaged. That's the Wynne, Arkansas. It looks like it also went very close to Earl and right over the top of Terrell. And now you can see it's moved to the north here near Munford. So that's Memphis. Memphis is safe, by the way, but it's just to the north. So here's the bigger view. These are all of our active tornado watches that we have. And I showed you all the tornado warnings. There's also a tornado warning. It looks like just popped up in between St. Louis and Peoria. Just an extremely violent atmosphere. This is a powerful storm. Yeah, go ahead.
I just want to ask, you mentioned Memphis and the active tornado there. I think people who watched the show for the last few minutes know that Blaine Alexander and her team is there. They are okay. They are safe.
Yeah, that tornado about 15 miles north of them. She said that she could hear the tornado sirens in the distance, and that's where she was hearing them from. So we're not in the clear yet from Memphis. That will probably take another 2 to 3 hours. There's still additional storms that could go through. In the hatched area, I mean, we could see strong tornadoes all the way through northern Mississippi, northern Alabama, and this will happen after dark, getting closer to midnight. And then tomorrow, we have this line of storms that's going to race through the Northeast. I mean, even New York City, Philadelphia, Boston, Albany, 50 million people tomorrow, Hallie. So this storm, not over by any means. Very dangerous night.
Bill Cairns, I know you have a busy night ahead of you as well. Our deepest thanks to you and our climate unit who are tracking all of these, trying to keep our team safe. Let us know what's going on so folks know out in Memphis and in Little Rock and in Iowa where these things are going. Thanks, Bill. So listen, NBC News covers hundreds of international stories every day in addition to these weather stories. And because you couldn't possibly read or watch or listen to them all, our foreign desk has done it for you. Here is some of what they're watching in a segment we call The Global. Out of India, at least 35 people have been killed after the floor of a Hindu temple collapsed during a ceremony. You can see it there. It turns out the structure, the floor was over a deep well that was filled with muddy water. Rescue crews knocked down part of the temple as they tried to get people out of that well. It had been packed with people celebrating the festival of the deity Rama. In Spain, firefighters are fighting about 100 wildfires in the northern part of the country, and they say these fires were set on purpose. More than 600 firefighters have come out to try to get a handle on these things. So far, no arrests. And from Japan, a government official has just rolled out a plan to try to reverse the declining birth rate in that country. It's going to give families with children, households with kids, some subsidies, some more money, and it's going to pay more for younger generations to promote childbirth. It's a big issue for Japan, where last year they had their lowest number of newborns since 1899. So tonight's original now with in-depth reporting on a topic we've been watching. And tonight, it's a look at who's leading all of us locally on the last day of Women's History Month. Right now, only 17 women of color have been voted into the mayor's offices in the country's biggest cities. And while that number shows there's still a long way to go, these women are making history now by shattering glass ceilings in their communities and paving the way for a new generation of girls.
Los Angeles is one of the most diverse cities in the country. Yet no woman had ever been mayor until Karen Bass made history.
And I will faithfully discharge the duties.
When she was elected last year.
Were you ever surprised that it took that long to get to that point?
Well, not for me personally, but yes, absolutely. It is incredible to think of how old our city is, and it took this long.
Her situation isn't unique. Bass is only one of a small group of women breaking glass ceilings across the country. Right now, only 33 women lead the nation's largest cities, and only 17 of them are women of color. But that's up 1,600% from 1980.
So what are some of the challenges you have faced specifically as a woman in the position?
I think women in leadership positions are always underestimated.
According to a 2019 study, female mayors are more than twice as likely as men to experience psychological abuse and almost 3 times as likely to experience physical violence.
Are any of you interested in politics?
No, not really.
Why?
The inequality.
Not too far from Bass's office, these high school students are feeling discouraged.
I think a lot of the times in politics, you see the stereotype that women get about being too emotional.
But they say Mayor Bass gives them hope.
Now that we have a woman of color representing, I think it would also like inspire other women of color.
Mayor Bass grew up in LA just like them, where she witnessed the civil rights movement, crack epidemic, and growing homelessness with the dream of making it better.
It's like my life has come full circle.
Over in Tucson, Arizona, Mayor Regina Romero is challenging the status quo.
I'm absolutely completely different than the norm.
She's the first woman and Mexican American to hold the title.
It's about me looking back and bringing others through those doors.
Romero is the only one in her family born in the U.S., so she understands the importance of representation.
When I turned 18, my dad was very, very clear with me that I was the only one in the family that would represent all of us.
And in Bakersfield, California, Mayor Karen Go, an Indian immigrant, says she didn't even realize she was breaking barriers until she was elected.
I have never been that conscious of my being different or Asian. My parents taught me that really shouldn't be the focus. Just working with excellence, working hard.
As the city's first mayor of color, she's won consecutive elections with the majority of the vote. These three now leading a wave of representation in local government, giving new hope to younger generations.
Now we have someone to look up to, and it just inspires us.
Nyala Charles, NBC News.
Our thanks to Nyala for that reporting. So then there were four. Obviously, the men's and women's college basketball tournaments having the Final Four coming up this weekend. Star power on the women's side this year with four huge schools left standing: Iowa, LSU, Virginia Tech, and of course the defending champ South Carolina. For the men, it has been a story of Cinderellas, lots of upsets. The first time ever there are no 1, 2, or 3 seeds left in the tournament, only Connecticut. UConn has made it to a Final Four before, and they're led in part, these teams, by a few players who are practicing Muslims observing Ramadan right now. It means they can't eat or drink until sunset, which means they only have 9 minutes to load up before Saturday's game. Corey Robinson joins us now. And listen, they have experience here, right? Last week's game, this came up. People in the NBA have had to deal with as well. You're a former college athlete. That's like yet another sort of thing to manage here.
As you mentioned, Hallie, Ramadan started last Wednesday, so they played UConn played Arkansas on the very next day, Thursday, and blew them out. So for me, what I look at this is what's most important to athletes. Athletes are creatures of habit. Is routine. You know,
totally.
Have I done this before? Can I plan for this? And if you can do that, then you can overcome that. So I'm not as worried about it.
Who's worried about it? It's sort of an interesting dynamic at play in the Final Four. Who are you watching? What are you looking for? Do you think, like, how many more upsets can we possibly get after a tournament that's been full of them?
There's only a couple games left, so I don't think that many.
Exactly, yeah.
Yeah, I think with UConn, I think they're the most dominant team, Hallie. So, I mean, they beat everybody by over 15 points. You know, Miami, I watched that Texas game. They looked like they weren't that dominant, until the very end. They eked one out. On the other end, you have two great, stories in San Diego State and FAU. But I think FAU is going to get the upper hand on that just because, that San Diego State game came down to a free throw. The first free throw was missed. The second free throw in the final 2 seconds won it for them. So for me, it's going to be FAU versus UConn, and UConn's going to win.
How about on the women's side? Who are you watching? Because I will tell you, I'm just going to be honest, my For You page, it is like all women's basketball players, and I'm here for it, and I'm watching them all, and I'm looking at all the highlights and all of it.
It's fantastic. Caitlin Clark is doing things that we have never seen before.
She is a superstar, yes.
No, you're completely right. I mean, superstar. We saw a 40-point triple-double. I mean, to advance to the Final Four, first time in 30 years for Iowa, and no one's ever done that, men's or women's. 41 points, a triple-double is just mind-boggling. So that matchup tonight, Hallie, is going to be much-watched television. South Carolina versus Iowa is going to be mind-blowing.
And that's going to be on ABC, right? Not ESPN.
Well, no, that will be on ESPN, but the final, the championship will be on. But, it's interesting you mentioned that because I think right now we're experiencing something in women's basketball that is actually phenomenal. Back in the day with the NBA, you had, Bill Russell, Wilt Chamberlain, they kind of laid the groundwork, Jerry West, those Lakers-Celtics rivalry, as far as, like, what is interesting. But now we're starting to see that at the WNBA level and the college level, which is really cool.
Corey Robinson, I'm excited for you to watch. I'm going to be watching. We'll talk again, I am sure, next week. Appreciate you. So listen, in a sign of how nerd culture is coming back in a big way, just look at the big box office weekend we're headed into with the highly anticipated Dungeons and Dragons movie coming out. Have you seen the trailer? And you know who's starring in this? Some of Hollywood's biggest leading men and women. Chris Pine, Joe Manganiello, Megan Fox. They're all embracing this. So what does this say about our evolving taste? B. Dave Walters, author of Dungeons and Dragons, A Darkened Wish, is with me now. So when a movie comes out like D&D, when people have been playing that OG game for a very long time, used to be something you'd be like, oh, I play secretly. Now you have people like Joe Manganiello who's like, oh, I play and I have a whole room for it, everything else. Does the movie match kind of the long history of this game? The reviews seem to be pretty good.
The movie's fantastic. It's so much fun. You don't have to know anything about the game to enjoy it. And yeah, I've seen this thing grow from just a thing we did just kind of in our parents' basement up to being on the main stage of cons. It's just been a great adventure.
The New York Times review, I thought this was interesting, talked about how fantasy adventures are not dweebs only. There's room at the table for all types. And it feels like Dungeons and Dragons is the latest and maybe most vivid example of the way that there's been a shift in what is considered cool in pop culture. And it's not the stuff that like 20 years ago, 15 years ago, when I was coming up in high school and whatever, people thought was cool.
I mean, The Lord of the Rings was 20 years ago.
Right,
so,
right.
I mean, I think it goes from The Lord of the Rings, it went straight into Iron Man, into the MCU, and being able to admit that you've loved these things since you were a kid. The people that grew up with this content are now the ones making this stuff, and they take it seriously. So, yeah, it is a great time to admit that you love dragons. Who doesn't? And just want to go.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, I'm rambling, please.
I was loving the ramble. I was just gonna, when you talk about Lord of the Rings, I will say, like, I think there was still, it was a huge movie, obviously, but there was still, maybe this is just like, but like still kind of a vibe of like, oh yeah, okay, Lord of the Rings stan, like a little bit, I get it, you're kind of a nerd. There was still like a little bit of that vibe, and I feel like when you talk about Marvel, that is to me what it seems like broke open the floodgates for saying, no, comic books actually are cool and hot and sexy and like all of these things.
Absolutely. You nailed it completely when you said there's room at the table for everybody. But you're right. When people are like, oh, it's okay to love Iron Man. Well, is it okay to love Spider-Man? Well, is it okay to love Superman? And the answer is yes, 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 yes. And now it is okay to love Dungeons and Dragons.
Well, and I know you do. You've seen it, what, once? How many times so far?
Oh, I've seen it twice already, and I'm probably going to see it again tonight. I got to go to a couple of premieres.
I love that. That is so cool. Thank you so much for that breakdown. It's good to see you, Dave Walters. Appreciate it. That's a wrap for this hour. Top Story starts right now.
Thanks for watching our YouTube channel. Follow today's top stories and breaking news by downloading the NBC News app.